In this episode of the Beyond the Horizon podcast, Enable Head Nerds Joe Ferla and Ben Lee dive into how MSPs can lead the way in Microsoft 365 when it comes to user enablement, Copilot adoption, and smarter management.
I see it time and time again with organizations where stuff's just turned on. And this is where, as an MSP, if you have information around this stuff, some usage guides, some information, that is a way of differentiating because it's value that you're adding. You're explaining how to use these tools and services to a better degree of their functionality than just like, tick, we've turned it on, we gave you a license, it's a thing.
Welcome to the second episode of our Managing the Cloud as an MSP podcast. Quick recap. The first episode, we had Stephanie Hammond on going over some sales and marketing tips and tricks as MSPs are looking at pushing more and more cloud services. And to continue today, we are joined by the newest head nerd here at Enable, Ben Lee, our
Hello.
Microsoft guru. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben real quick to give us the rundown on who he is, where he came from, and what he brings to the table on the Head Nerd team. So Ben,
All
I'll
right.
turn it over to you for a minute.
Sounds good, Joe. Thanks very much. Happy to be here. So I started with Enable, I think it was back in February, and very different time of the year, sitting here sweltering in my blacktop. We picked the best day in the UK to record this in my hot bedroom. But my background, like you say, is I've never worked for Microsoft, but I have spent the majority of my career working with Microsoft technologies. So that has been as an IT technician fixing printers, as an administrator, helping kind of shape and define how we offered user services to an MSP, and then more recently as a consultant. And I've spent a lot of my career kind of dealing with Microsoft's unified communications offerings, actually. So a lot of my background was around kind of telephony, but telephony leads you into Teams these days, which leads you into M365, which leads you into the whole kind of fun big gamut of Microsoft stuff that I'm sure we will end up touching on in the next 30 minutes or so as we go through this.
Yeah, I always find if you touch one Microsoft product, it's kind of like the gateway drug into the rest of Microsoft. They seem to do very well with giving you an easy to implement individual tool and just keep you delving into that rabbit hole of, oh, Teams was
Yeah.
pretty easy. What can I do next?
Well, especially this is very true on the productivity side in particular. Microsoft has a habit that they will kind of produce tools and solutions that do things, but then they have a lot of stuff that overlaps, and they leave it to end users to figure out how they want to use them. And quite often this is one of the gaps with kind of IT teams will enable a tool, they'll turn something on, but they don't necessarily kind of help offer advice and guidance and strategies for user adoption and getting up and running. Like if you look at kind of the productivity suite of Microsoft at the moment, they're doing a massive revamp on Outlook. They're driving Copilot deep into a lot of their tooling and the technologies. We've got stuff like Loop starting to overlap with OneNote. We've got tasks in Teams and planner tasks and to-do tasks, but there's not a lot of guidance. So like which one do you use when, what's appropriate for what scenario, how do you get into that? So you can imagine if that's on the productivity side, we have a similar but to a lesser degree issue on the kind of enterprise and infrastructure and tooling side as well, right? Of like, what's the right way to manage something, what's the right way to monitor something, like there is a whole ton of ways that you can do all of these different things, and chances are you can do all of what you need to do. But to your point, you've got to figure out for yourself how to get there, how to make it work nicely. Even when stuff's working, is it working correctly? And this is one of the things as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to cover.
And kind of delving into this rabbit hole you started here, it hits quite nicely on kind of the first topic I really wanted to cover with you as we talk about MSPs making the move to the cloud, and as we talk about networks and infrastructure and the like moving to the cloud.
Yeah.
Why Microsoft, right? We all know they're the biggest player in the market, but that can't be the reason, right? It can't be just because they own, I think it was 80% of business
I mean, it's a
OS
good reason,
footprint.
but
And it's a great
but
reason,
it's a good
but
reason for a point that is that if you're trying to do something, if you're trying to troubleshoot something, someone has generally been there before you, got an
Mhm.
answer, got a strategy, got a thing. So I'm not saying it's the right answer, but it certainly plays a part into it. I think to me, the answer is actually more along the lines of, because of Microsoft's history and track record here, there was a period through probably the early 2000s where Microsoft was getting slammed left, right, and center with lawsuits and monopolies and all this kind of stuff, and they were probably quite complacent because they were at such a kind of peak of the market. Um, but if you look at where we're at now, I think one of those main reasons that they're in the position they're in is that they take, I want to say enterprise IT, but that gives the wrong impression, right? Because we're not with MSP stuff, we're not necessarily talking about enterprise, but there are still the same level of considerations around data security and data protections and making sure that you have adequate protections, for want of a better word, in place for dealing with all of your data, looking after stuff, looking after the machines that you've got out there, looking after the data and all the different containers it's in. And Microsoft is incredibly good at that, so they provide complex tools because they have such a history in them, but they are also massively flexible and are adaptable to many, many different scenarios and situations that users wish to use them in. And yeah, sure, there's blind spots there. We're only at a point where kind of native Mac support is acceptable. Again, you roll back 10 years and that was a very different story. You look at Microsoft's positioning around Linux. It's not there for all of the tooling, but it's something that is being taken a lot more seriously, again, because it has to be, because that's where the customers are. And I guess that's a challenge with Microsoft, is Microsoft will develop, they'll develop for the 80%, right? They want to develop their next version of the tooling, their next feature, their next whatever it is for 80% of their market. And that can sting and that can hurt people if they're not in that 80% of they need something and it doesn't do it. Unfortunately, you need to go look somewhere else for third party products or solutions or whatever it may be. So coming back around to that, why are they as pervasive as they are? Because they do actually offer a very comprehensive set of tools, product solutions, and offerings, and they have a long, long history that they bring to the table of making sure that those are not done in the right way, but done in a way that takes into consideration all of the main things that businesses and enterprises need.
Yeah, and one of the things you were mentioning there is they do bring a very complex and flexible tool set to the market here. But I think, at least from my experience, that complex might be the wrong word, right? Because every time I've talked to you since you've been here at Enable with issues about Microsoft, there's always a reasonably simple solution. It might be intricate, it might be finicky or tedious, but there's always, a solution that's like, "Oh, why didn't you think of this?" Right? And then I look at my introduction to really managing Microsoft as an MSP a few years ago when I was managing veterinary offices. There really wasn't too much complexity to the problems I was solving. It
Yeah,
was more so tedious to implement, right? If I needed to pull, say, a report on all risky users or a report on MFA status, it's there. It's
yeah,
tedious to get, but it's there.
yeah.
And they reasonably tell you how to do it,
But
right? So
that's
I
back
found
to that 80% thing though, right? Of like the method of getting the data is there or the report that you want is there. So ultimately it's not going to sell any more licenses, which is what Microsoft wants. It's not going to move the needle on anything if it's hard to get to or if it's a challenge to get to. And this is that the key thing about kind of MSPs and managing at scale. Microsoft do have some versions of solutions for how you can manage across an estate, a suite at scale, but it's almost ticking a box. It's like yes, we have the mechanisms to do that. That doesn't mean it's a very efficient mechanism to do it, or that it's a very good mechanism of doing it, or that there's loads of hoops you have to jump through. But this is that like, well, they don't mind. Like it doesn't matter. It's not moving the needle on something that actually
Mhm.
is a problem or is gonna impact their bottom line, I guess. And that's where third party stuff comes in.
And that seems to be one of the larger struggles for the MSP space. Um, Kind of building off of that, where you say like it's made for the 80% and third party tooling comes into play a lot. That seems to be very, I don't want to use the word corporate or enterprise because of the connotation, but that's where it sits, right?
Yeah.
It seems to be very much designed for an individual environment in an individual business, and it does exceptionally well. Once as an MSP, you start managing 10, 20, 50, 100, 1,000 businesses, it does become more difficult to work with, and third party tools do become much more pervasive.
Yeah.
Outside of that, while we talk about the ease of the tool, there are going to be some roadblocks and there's are going to be some pitfalls in that kind of deal. Where do you see Microsoft and the MSP having that split? And having those kind of management or implementation issues.
Yeah, it's that issue of scale and scalability. You have Microsoft has their native suite of tools for management. They have Arc for dealing with the Azure side of stuff. They have Intune for dealing with device management side of stuff. They have GDAP for dealing with delegated admin permissions and all those kinds of things. But they all work the way that they work, and if you want them to work slightly differently and be slightly more time efficient or operating at scale in a slightly better fashion, then yeah, you know th- you either need to wait for those things to evolve in that direction, which I'm not sure that's where they're going to be going, because that scenario for Microsoft is not a core or key scenario. It's a pain for those that have that pain, but it's not a blocking pain. It's not enough to stop you using their tooling and their suites of
Mhm.
things. And that's where the third party stuff, and circling that third party thing back in, the question you asked right at the start of, like, why is Microsoft such a ubiquitous thing? Part of it is also the third party tooling and support, right? Microsoft is very open to allowing third parties to solve their platform's problems. That doesn't mean that Microsoft won't then trample all over it by implementing something into their product if it reaches that point.
Mhm.
But there is a very broad third party ecosystem, and Microsoft again is being more friendly about supporting those kinds of things. Like an example would be with their backup tooling and technology. For many, many years, there was not native backup capabilities inside M365. There were third party tools like Cove that were able to extract the data and deal with it and store it somewhere else. But Microsoft then started implementing their own backup solution natively into their products. It's paid for, and you need to do the cost calculations to figure out, which side of the fence you land on, which one's good value for you. But the fact that they're doing that in their product now means that the third parties have better access and better capabilities natively to be able to back up the stuff that's there. So that you kind of get these cycles of improvement, of third parties plugging gaps, Microsoft improving what their native offering is, so the third party can then move on to the next challenge or implement stuff in an even stronger fashion.
And that kind of hits home, at least for me, from the MSP space, in that I always feel like MSPs, sheerly out of necessity, and then how easy and agile it is to evolve an MSP business, that they are a step ahead of where, say, enterprise sits. Right. So you talk about M365 backup, and you mentioned Cove or Veeam or any of these other
Yeah.
competitors of enabled. We all had this, you know 5 years ago, a decade ago in some cases,
Yep.
right? um and that seems to be one of the difficult things, I think, for MSPs, but one of the things they don't kind of understand, because it's always this gripe I hear with MSPs of, oh, Microsoft isn't on the bleeding edge. Well, how can they be? Right? It's such a large organization with so many moving parts in it.
Yeah.
It just it can't. Third party usage has to drive that development, it seems like.
It does. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I would argue that for the first time in, I'm not going to hazard a guess at the number of years, a long time of Microsoft's history, they are actually at the bleeding edge of one of the kind of evolutions that we're seeing at the moment with the use of Gen AI technology, right? Like, Microsoft with their Copilot offering, they managed to be at that breaking crest of the wave as that came in, because they'd had their early investments with OpenAI. And if we talk about the strengths of Microsoft at the beginning, which is their productivity suite, Microsoft has access to most users' data, Teams calls, conversations, email. Like, so what they are doing to embed Copilot into that stuff actually makes that a very valuable tool. And now, obviously you have things like Claude and Grok and, OpenAI with their native ChatGPT stuff, but they are having to fight, struggle, figure out how to do those deeper integrations into the places where users have their data. Whereas Microsoft with Copilot has access to that data, subject to you have the right license, blah blah blah. It's Microsoft, we can talk about that as much as you would like. But that is one area I would say that they are at the forefront and have managed to kind of recapture some of their glory days positioning, if you like. But interestingly, nicely, all of that stuff I talked about having to make sure that it's compliant and data protections and privacy laws and all that stuff are taken into account, they are managing to deal with all of that at the same time, which is, it's kind of good to see them kind of not going all guns blazing, but in a mildly restrained fashion to still make sure that they're doing all the right things that they should do.
Yeah, and it's been interesting with the trainings you've been doing here at Enable and the utilization of Copilot, and how much access there is to pull the information, to pull the data you need to manipulate it,
Hmm.
for Pete's sakes. And then also, I found just presenting the information, right? Having Copilot not only with access to Exchange or sorry, M365 and Teams or any of your databases and the like, but also having it in PowerPoint and Word
Yeah.
and Excel, and being able to look at, say, interact with a SQL database in Copilot,
Hmm.
and then immediately say, okay, I want you to pump this information into Excel and perform this bit of data analysis. While that's happening, go, hey, can we take this chart and pump it into PowerPoint to give me a presentation that I
Yeah.
could present to a technical staff, to enter or to C level suites, right? It's been an exceptional tool. Copilot has been something that continues to blow my mind.
It
Um,
has, but this is also back to that point of like, what would a challenge for MSPs or users be? We've talked mostly about technical challenges, but I did mention earlier that challenge of like, how do you use the tools? How do you do adoption? Like, we fell into that trap with deploying Copilot here. I believe that we kind of rolled out the license and it's like, hey, you've got access to Copilot, go do stuff with it. Someone asks it a question like, give me a report on the status of ABC, doesn't get anything back that they want, and they go back to using ChatGPT because in ChatGPT it's designed to output the data in a different format. It's meant to be more long form. It can do web searches in a different way. Whereas actually, with a little bit of understanding of how to use it, what it can and can't do, where you use it. You mentioned Copilot in PowerPoint. If you try and ask Copilot in PowerPoint to do anything other than help you with a slide, it's going to say no and it's going to fall over. So it's like knowing that Copilot is not one thing. It's like there's a Copilot here and a Copilot here and a Copilot there. But that's the problem that many organizations struggle with, and an MSP would struggle with as well, is you can light up, you can turn on, you can do all the technical implementation of these widgets and these gubbins, but you also there needs to be some level of kind of buy-in from the end user around training or understanding how to use them, or best practices for usage. And that's a very hard thing to do, and it's easy to miss. So that then it can be, well, we turned it on, we gave it to everybody. I'm generalizing here, but Copilot, whatever, it didn't work. It doesn't do what we need it to do. To your point before, when we've been talking, there is usually a way of doing something. It's just not something that people know about. So without that adoption wrapper around, that you kind of come back to, well, the technology's bad, the tool doesn't work, and you sack it off and go find something else to do it. Where actually, it's maybe just it wasn't not implemented properly. That's not quite the right terminology, but it wasn't kind of explored or expressed, or the value wasn't kind of shown.
the patience wasn't there,
Yeah.
right? What I found with Copilot and working with it, and I promise we'll get back to more
So
device and cloud stuff in a minute. But I think this kind of mentality works across the board with Microsoft is, if you don't have the patience, right, you're never going to get good results, right? So we talk about Copilot. I found I needed to go in and do like 5 to 10 projects in Copilot in each of its little areas to get exactly what I wanted out of it, because Copilot was learning me while I was learning how to use
Yeah.
it. Whereas compared to Chat GPT, I may get a result I like on my first query, but it doesn't have that learning. It doesn't learn what I like, right? And I feel like Copilot has,
Mhm.
right? So now when I'm going in and using Copilot, at least my licensing, it is putting out better information or better results than I would get from ChatGPT because of that patience, I feel. But then you also look at kind of transitioning us into like Azure or Intune or M365, while it's not learning you, but the same thing's there, right? If you don't have the patience to learn from your mistakes and evolve as you're moving to the cloud or as you are living in the cloud, right? Microsoft's going to get frustrating and you're going to give up on it,
Yeah.
I feel. But that being said, as we move into the cloud, looking at, say, the big four, right? M365, Entra, Intune, and Azure,
Mhm.
right? What are some of these best practices outside of what we've kind of been talking about that our MSPs can use or MSPs should know as they're living in this cloud world?
Yeah, I think we've touched on kind of the challenges around management and management at scale. I think on the M365 and productivity side, trying to treat users as this model of personas, if that tracks, kind of makes
Mhm.
sense, that you have personas of users who operate in a particular fashion, who do this kind of work or this kind of thing, that you can then kind of look at configuration of policies against those personas, so that you're kind of having a standard baseline for this is an information worker type persona, this is a you know mobile worker type persona, this is a factory floor persona, whatever it may be. But that means you can then have personas for these are the kind of policies and configuration that they have. This is the kind of licensing that they have. And you're never going to get a one size fits all across the number of size and scale of businesses that an MSP would be dealing with. But trying to have some form of standardization in the same way that, a lot of MSPs that we talk to have standardization around how they handle patching and the patch schedules. And then you have deviations from that scheduling as you need, looking at kind of the user licensing and the user productivity stack and the user kind of tooling that is available in terms of personas and standardizing those, I think can be a helpful exercise. The practicalities of making that a reality are that it can be challenging, but I think that is a useful thing to kind of look at and to consider. And then the same thing applies at the technical layer across things like how you're handling enter ID, and if you've got hybrid ID, how you're handling what's the term, hybrids, where you're synchronizing your information and all that kind of stuff. It's again, it's making sure that these platforms are configured as consistently as you can across the different environments, so that when you're troubleshooting or you have an issue or you have a ticket, you're as standardized as you can across all of those
Mhm.
core components. But I fully appreciate that is a lot easier said than done.
Yeah, that kind of, thinking about that standardization like leads me to when I was an MSP and you mentioned like packages and service offerings. I was standardizing based off of security needs, right? What is my risk acceptance? What are you willing to hand over? And are you a high, medium, or low security risk,
Mhm.
right? But it seems like with Microsoft, I don't want to say it's a moving target as to what we're standardizing off of, but there's so many different layers, right? We talk about standardization of these personas, then we have standardization of environment management and the like. Is there anything in your mind that we could use to consolidate that basis for standardization, right? Because it seems like we want to get to management by exception, but I'll admit I haven't found a client as an MSP that isn't an exception to standardization in the
Yeah.
Microsoft world. Is there's something we could do to make that easier to kind of put you on the spot?
Not that comes to mind at the top of my head. I mean, this is where there is an evolution of tooling and third party stuff, and third party scripting and that kind of stuff that can help with elements of those, but not that will tie those things all together with a neat little bow on top, because I don't think, I think such a thing would be a struggle. You have stuff like DSC, desired state configuration, where you can kind of say this is what security implementations we want to have in my tenant, and there's a CISO do their scuba, the American kind of bureau of how government offices should have their tenants configured. They have a script that you can run to kind of audit a tenant against that kind of baseline. So I kind of future that we can strive for is being able to have these are configuration baselines that I want for the two key elements, and that would be like the security and the configuration, and the second would be that end user orientated configuration, because I feel that is one that is, sorry, I'm banging the drum because it's my background, but I feel it is something that is often overlooked. There's a lot of time and effort spent in device security, service management, device management, and to that point of like the end users just kind of then get left to their own devices. So being able to
Oh,
deal with baselines for those two tiers of things would be what would do it. And at the moment, no, it's a piecemeal. It's a piecemeal process. Like, even the stuff like we have with Cloud Commander, that is not where that is at this point in time with being able to manage cross tenant.
yeah, and you mentioned something quite interesting there, kind of like in that spiel with the end user tends to be forgotten. And this is something that when I talk through management within Insight, our RMM platform, or I hear Lewis talk about security, the ability to prevent an end user from doing something or the ability to manage what they're doing is paramount. And I feel like you're right. In the Microsoft world, they get forgotten, they get overlooked, or defaults are just selected, and defaults never enough.
Yeah.
But then you look at things like what's it, 60 to 70% of data breach is caused by an end user, right? Is
Yep.
it like phishing, right? You have, issues with any type of, just misclick with end users. You see people forgetting, like, conditional access policy. You see people just going, oh yeah, Microsoft takes care of all this. You know, is there something that you could recommend to kind of make that user management easy, but also drive home that Microsoft is very good at it, right?
Yeah. Well,
And MSPs need to pick it up more.
those things you talked about, it's the protections of you're protecting the user from themselves, right? You're stopping them clicking a thing in an email, sending a file where they shouldn't send it, whatever that may be. But the kind of the point, I guess, that I want to make sure I get it through is that it's also that layer of like, are they resorting to using third party tools or third party solutions because something has been locked down or has been restricted, from a security standpoint, with the best intentions of like, well, we're not turning that on, but like actually maybe teams with a bit of configuration would actually do what you need to do so that the user isn't having to work around something and do it, and you can then do it in a secure manner, in a controlled manner. And because this is right back to that stuff at the start, that Microsoft is very good at driving their data protections and securities through all of their tools. It's just a case of knowing what you use when, and how to do it right. So again, is there any particular tips or things to understand? I mean, not really. That's not a magic answer. Like, there is no magic answer. There is the hard work bit is understanding what the use cases are for a particular business or for a particular sector or segment, or vertical, and seeing how much of that stuff can be standardized and rationalized. And Microsoft then, there are generally PowerShell scripts to be able to deploy this policy with this name, but again, doing that at scale, it's not straightforward. But kind of once you've done it and you've got it to that point, it makes management after that a little bit simpler. But we all know that we live by exceptions and not the rules. So
Hmm. So it kind of boils down to the best tip or trick you would have would be do your homework, know your partners, and before you dive into just randomly trying to implement this, Microsoft has a lot of good education.
yeah.
Microsoft has a lot of good certifications. They have incredibly well laid out learning paths, right? Utilize those tools. Right? It's
Yeah,
worth the 75 to 125 to $250 for the tests and classes to get those certifications.
yeah, and I guess the certifications are great because they give you an overview of a very broad slice of whatever the particular tool and technology is. The bit I temper it with is that having been on the other end of that and writing some of those tests myself, the real world examples that get used in there can end up being fairly contrived, and the way Microsoft wants you to run something in an exam is not the way that you would actually run it in real life. But so like kind of if I could modify that takeaway a little bit, it would be that you are always going to have a friction between what functionality you enable or disable based on the security requirements, but make sure it is a balance of what the business requirements actually are. So that you're balancing the risk and the security infosec side with the business requirements of what people actually need to do to be able to do their job.
Mhm. And moving away from, say, user management here as well, and into like device management, or more network and infrastructure management, as we move into the Azure world, as we move into the Intune world a bit more with device management or MDM. What are some of the pitfalls you see there, and some of the ways that we can start overcoming some of the common gotchas, if you will?
Yeah, I think Intune has a fairly long pedigree with its kind of Microsoft with their device management roots back in SMS and SCCM, and then kind of morphing into Intune. Although those remnants of those do still knock around for various things. I think with Intune in particular, you end up with split management. So Intune is more your kind of end user facing devices, and Azure Arc is where Microsoft wants you to be for kind of server and machine management. And we kind of see Microsoft like they're offering things like Azure Local, where you can have Azure racks in your data centers, and but you have to be operating at significant scale, I would imagine, to make that kind of stuff worthwhile. But that's where their management story is for those things, is kind of a split between the Arc side of things and the Intune side of things. And on the Intune side of things, there's still stuff that it can be fairly rudimentary in how it operates, in terms of flexibility around patch scheduling or for installation of software or those kinds of things. And then this is back to that, like if it meets your needs, if it does what you want, great. And if it doesn't, there are third-party solutions that have elements of Intune integration or not to deal with kind of patching in a better fashion, or to deal with application management in a better fashion. So it's that, make sure you have an understanding of what the learn.microsoft.com official version of how you would manage your estate and your suite and stuff would look like, and then figure out how that maps against what you want to do, and where your limitations of dealing with it at scale are, because those tools aren't natively designed to operate. They're designed to operate at scale kind of this way inside an organization to manage tens, hundreds, thousands, whatever of endpoints, but they're not designed to manage 10 over here, 20 over here, 50 over here, 100 over there,
Mhm.
500 over there. That's kind of their challenges, right?
So we talk about these struggles, and it's come up quite often that when we hit a limitation with Microsoft, right? There's always a third party, right? Or there's always another smaller solution within Microsoft, outside of, again, we'll call it like the big four, right? Where you see Entra, 365, Intune, and Azure. What tools in the Microsoft suite should MSPs be looking at using? We know Copilot. I think we hammered on that one pretty hard earlier. But what else? And then what third party tools do you in the real world like using?
Um,
Sponsorships not included.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're kind of putting M365 as a bucket there. I mean, to me, Teams is something that is, and obviously it is under the M365 bucket, but Teams is something that I see either underutilized or badly utilized. And again, that's, my perspective as a Teams person, right? I've spent many years dealing with Teams and Teams telephony and that kind of stuff. But the reason I say badly utilized is that Teams is a massively powerful tool, but it needs to be tuned and it needs to be monitored and it needs to be have a little bit of love to make sure that it's working in the way that you want it to work. Because in terms of a fundamental collaboration platform, it's great. There are so many things that it can do that just don't get turned on or get turned off because they're a security risk without actually understanding what the implications of those things would be. So, Teams is something that I feel is underutilized. That's kind of a very poor answer to your question because I'm struggling to find another answer to to
Well,
your
so
to your.
we can delve into teams real quick though a little bit, because I don't disagree with what you're saying, right? We have the example of you joining the Head Nerd team and immediately spending 2 months revamping how the Nerds team works within Microsoft
Because we weren't
Teams.
using it as a team. We had a chat that
Right.
was a nerds chat. We didn't have a team. And the team is supposed to be the hub for the collaboration. So when I joined, it's like, oh, we need to get you permissions over here to this calendar. We need permissions over here for this file share. We need permissions over here for this thing. It's like, no, the M365 group that sits at the heart of, Microsoft 365 security, I should be placed into that group. That group gives me access to the team. That team then has channels and chats and conversations so that with Copilot, I can say, oh, hey, Joe said something that he was working on a podcast about something. Can you find me details of what happened the last time? And then I can find like you and Lewis having a conversation in the channel about, well, this is the podcast, this is the format, this is what we're going to discuss. If you just had that in a one-on-one chat, fine, it wasn't relevant to me at the time. But when it is relevant to me because I kind of want to understand what the format is, the data's not there. Whereas if all of that stuff happened inside a team, where as long as it's not something that is supposed to be confidential or supposed to be private, asterisk, there is ways of dealing with that inside teams anyway.
Hmm.
But if the notion is working out loud, if you're working and putting data in a place that it is visible to those who might want to have access to it in future, subject to security permissions, then you get more value out of it. And that's where Copilot, if I was wanting to prep for this and I said to Copilot, hey, can you give me an idea what the usual format for this kind of a podcast would be? I would only get data out of my email and there wouldn't be anything else. But if you'd had like a little thread for the different podcasts that you've done with the chat about this is what we're going to cover, this is how it worked, I would get more data back to be more valuable about, well, this is what normally happens. This is the point 36 minutes in, Ben, that you should shut up and stop talking because Joe wants to do this bit in the thing. I have more information, right?
Right. No, and that was actually one of the other examples I was going to use, kind of, is that I think it took 4 years after I joined Enable for me to see channels getting heavily used within teams. It was all chat based, and I was
And
pulling my hair out for this. And we're still not, as an organization, fully utilizing channels.
and I can guarantee you that that's because when it was deployed, no one did that explaining the usage, understanding the usage piece. It was just a here's Teams, here's the license, run free, use it.
Right.
So there would have been a no or rudimentary sorry to anyone who did maybe try and do this. I don't know, but I see it time and time again with organizations where stuff's just turned on. There's no strategy, and I'm not saying go to the nth degree, but like a little bit of a when should you use a team versus when you use a channel, and what kind of a channel should you use, and when do you use a meeting versus a whatever. It's like, and these can be a little bit more generic guides, and this is where as an MSP, if you have information around this stuff, some usage guides, some information, that is a way of differentiating because it's value that
Hmm.
you're adding. It's value of like you're explaining how to use these tools and services to a better degree of their functionality than just like tick, we've turned it on, we gave you a license, you paid for a license, so it's a thing.
Yeah, and that kind of, at least to me, hits on a little bit of one of the difficulties of Microsoft is they can't have sales engineers like us, where if you purchase a license, you're guaranteed onboarding and such as you go through the enable process. You have to do it on your own.
Yeah.
And then the other thing too is education on the Microsoft space is a revenue driver. A
Hmm.
once a quarter lunch and learn how to better utilize Teams, how to better utilize Outlook, how to pick up on a phishing attack, security settings for you and your
Yeah.
organization, right? These are things that we as MSPs can't get our hands on because Microsoft just doesn't have the scale to do it,
No.
right? It's
And
impossible. So the MSPs taking the certifications, going through the trainings, talking to folks like yourself at Enable, and then bringing that to the end user seems to be invaluable. But you see very little uptick on it because the MSPs I think, tend to operate under this idea of we've been using Windows, so we'll just call it Microsoft, since what, 95,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe you were a bit earlier than that, but we'll say Windows 95, I think, is when we got really pervasive in the Microsoft world, or really into the Microsoft world. They expect end users to be comfortable with it, right? You had printer problems in 1995. The way to fix them is still reasonably the same in 2025, right?
Hit it.
You should know how to do this. And I
Yeah.
think MSPs overestimate that familiarity. And I think that's a stumbling block that we have.
Yeah, I said in my career history, one of the places I worked as a consultant in the MSP world, and we used to do exactly that. We would have, one Friday a week, kind of customers come in the office, have a chat. We'd go through what the latest developments were, what a new project feature, whatever it is, and quite often those would spin off into little nice nuggets of project work for like, actually now let's do a strategy for how to do that. Let's do an implementation here. Let's do a whatever. It was a nice way of kind of deepening that engagement.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to steal that, by the way. I'm thinking about sending, yourself to the end user to do a lunch and learn, not get them into the office, right? Which is exceptional because now they're meeting all of the staff. They're getting
Yeah.
familiar with you as a business. They're having water cooler talk with you folks in your office, right? It seems to be a very nice unconscious retention play.
Mhm.
And you can do it at scale. I don't need to focus on one client at a time. I can have 10, 15, 20 in my office. Maybe not more than 20. I think that's a good reasonable number. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? But to continue to do that and build familiarity with yourself is exceptional. Because MSPs, if we're doing our job well, we don't talk to our end users. The more your end users don't know you're there, the better we are at our job, right? So bringing that familiarity in and bringing that ability to work with them seems to be quite nice.
Yep. I agreed.
Nice. And let's do this. We're kind of going on a little bit long here. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, as I know it's incredibly valuable. So what I'll do is I'll kind of turn the floor over to you, where I stop poking and prodding and say, what do you think we've missed in this podcast? What do you think I should have been asking and should have been moving the needle towards?
I mean, you keep putting us on the spot, don't you? Um,
Dude, I'm here to ask the tough questions. We're not gonna give you an easy time to get through this.
no, I mean, I think we've touched on kind of a lot of the key areas, and like it's not all roses either, is it? Like we've talked about how Microsoft is in the big position that they're in, how they're the de facto tool set for a lot of these things, a lot of these businesses. Um, but that's not without its challenges, which are the running at scale. The If you have a solution that doesn't fit what Microsoft wants you to do, then you're struggling a little bit, or you're having to wait a long time for something to come around and be devs because chances are they're not building it for you. Um, but again, that's back to the third party stuff and where that plugs in and how it fits. Like, is there anything that I should have asked you or wanted to touch on? I mean, I don't think you asked me enough about Teams, if I'm honest, or Copilot. They're or Loop. We didn't talk about Loop. Loop's my current other hot area of stuff to play with at the moment. No, I
So
think we've done a good job of rounding most of those things.
yeah, and I'll kind of bring on to that at scale. I always hear MSPs complain about Microsoft doesn't like the little guy. Microsoft doesn't like the small business. Microsoft doesn't like us.
Mm,
Um, and one of the things I always had to remind myself as an MSP is they're trying their best. Like you said, they're developing for 80%. But it's also, I think, developing for their necessity and the scale that they work.
yeah,
So, like the example I use, because I come from account management um, uh, at Enable, is if I'm a Microsoft sales director and I have one account manager who can manage 120 accounts, I want them managing 120 $20 million accounts. I don't want them managing 120 $100,000 accounts. So when Microsoft has that scale and that ability to work where their average client may very well be close to 20 million in ARR or annual revenue, right?
Yeah.
Going down to the small folks is difficult because it's them sacrificing revenue just to work with the small guys, just to work with the small businesses. And that was something when I was an MSP, I had to constantly remind myself because I would always get to a point where it's like, I'm managing veterinary offices with 50 employees. I can see where what I'm doing in the Microsoft world would be amazing if I had 5,000,
Hmm.
right? Why can't I gear it towards this small office? And then, always because Microsoft doesn't have the capability to develop for that. I wish
Yeah.
they did. I wish they had, another spinoff. Let's add another department to
No,
Microsoft,
please,
right?
please don't. Please don't.
But on that note, Ben, look, I'll say thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is a great kind of segue from Stephanie and her sales and marketing into our next episode, which is going to be Lewis and security. If you'd like to join to temper Lewis and kind of keep him on track, you're more than welcome to
Sure.
kind of spoil what's going to happen in the next podcast. Um, but it's been a pleasure having you today. Thank you so much for putting up with me and all my questions. And
No worries.
um, we'll look forward to seeing you for maybe a more advanced or maybe a follow up to this as Microsoft continues to evolve. And I think I heard Loop could be its own podcast now.
Well, yes, maybe. There was one thing that sprung to mind as you were saying that it was just
Perfect.
with kind of rounding out my side on is you talked about that 50 versus the 500 versus the 5,000 users, and Microsoft obviously does have their more small business orientated solution for M365, right, which is their business standard and their business
Mhm.
premium plans. But there's one interesting omission in the business premium plan, right? So in the enterprise side, you have your E3 and your E5, and the differentiator between your E3 and your E5 is mostly around your data security, your data compliance, your data retention. So that is stuff like labeling, data loss prevention, stopping stuff leaving your Exchange servers on the edge, all that kind of fun stuff. Um, and I talked about this when we had the Enable Berlin conference. It was part of my like Microsoft Channel Futures thinking. Is that I find it interesting that Microsoft doesn't have a small business version of that offering yet, and that's because it's not a thing that's on the radar for small businesses and most MSPs at this point in time. But to me, that's very much a watch this space. Like we're figuring out how to deal with the device security. We're figuring out how to deal with user security, like figuring out how to deal with the stuff that's actually being protected, the thing we care about, which is the data. Like there's not a good story there for MSPs and small businesses because it relies on very high end, expensive Microsoft licensing. So, my kind of keeping an eye on it over the next 3 year time span. That's something I'm going to be interested to see. Is at what point we end up with a purview style license for the business premium edition plans. So, yeah.
Nice. So hopefully somebody's listening and goes, remind me in 3 years. We'll see if Ben was right or wrong. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Uh, Hopefully we can come back and see your predictions being correct.
Well, we'll see.
Um,
Yeah, sorry, just that popped into my head, and
no,
I ruined your very lovely outro. So from my side, thank you very much for having me along, and happy to be back at any point that you fancy, and I will declutter behind me as well sufficiently.
all right,
Good
Ben. It
stuff.
was a pleasure. We'll talk to you later.
All right,
Thank you for
thank you very
joining.
much. Bye bye.